when it comes to evaluating your stand and deciding whether or not you're going to replant, it's really tough. It's kind of a judgment call, and this is one of the things where we always say, look, if it is a real judgment call, it's not just black and white, probably better ask around, ask a few people, get their opinions. But we want to talk through a little bit with our opinions today on what your stand may look like and when you should pull the trigger on replanting corn or soybeans.
All right, first let's talk about evaluating the stand. When you're out looking at, let's just use corn for an example, and you say, I planted 30,000, I'm seeing 25,000. The most important thing for me right away is I want to see what happened to the other 5,000. I don't want to just assume what happened to it. I want to dig those seeds up and see what I find. It's interesting to me how this can really vary. Maybe there were birds out in your field, like pheasants, for example, that we see in our state, that a lot of times will go and pick corn seeds right out of the ground. Well, that's possible, and it could just be in a part of the field. It could be that you had some certain disease out there.
Try to figure out what went wrong so you can do something about it in the future. That's helped us a lot, because now when we're going to plant early into cold soils, we're doing things like putting fungicide in there, insecticide, some fertilizer, a biological, and that's helped us overcome some of the problems we've had in the past.
The other thing is, keep in mind what your population that you put out there in the first place was. Like, for example, on our farm, we're varying population throughout the field, really in every one of our fields. So if you're looking at an area that was only 27,000 to start with, and there's another area in that field that's 36,000, they are going to look quite different. I've been out on calls with farmers that said, oh man, my stand is terrible. And when we get out there, it's like, wow, it's consistently 24,000 all throughout the field. And then the light bulb comes on. Oh, I forgot to adjust that. I was going to just do that in part of the field. So if you've got one of those things, or if you're varying the population throughout, make sure you know what the target is first.
All right, here's the big thing. This is the number one thing when I'm evaluating a stand. It has nothing to do with the stand. It has everything to do with the date. If I say, wow, I'm a month past my ideal planting date, then I say, you know what, I can accept a much worse stand. If I'm still pretty much in my ideal planting date and I had something go terribly awry, then that's a whole different discussion, because now I have 100% of my yield potential left. So this is one of the great things too. Let's say it's hail, for example, that affects your stand. There are hail charts out there. There's been all kinds of work done on this for years. You can just look up on the internet Iowa State University hail charts, and it will tell you what you can expect for yield and at what point you should probably be thinking about replanting in corn or in soybeans.
And this makes a huge difference depending on where you're at in the country. For example, if you're up along the Canadian border, well, you've got a short growing season, and all of a sudden replanting corn may not be an option because you just don't have early enough corn.
That's exactly my point. It's how far away from the ideal planting date are you? And most of the time, quite frankly, my stand has to be awfully horrible before I'm going out replanting. Most of the time, I'm willing to accept a 70%, 80% stand, something like that. Yeah, I don't like it. I'm not saying that's ideal, but by the time I spend the money and take the time to replant, and don't forget, the plants that are left there, as long as they're good, you have 70% of the plants that could still get 100% of your yield potential. Now, if you're going to replant the whole field, you have 100% of your plants that could only get 80 or 90% of your yield potential. Are you any ahead? In most cases, no.
Okay, here's the other thing. Let's just say it's corn that you're having a replant situation, but you've got half a stand left. How do you get rid of the other half a stand? Now, if you're using the same trait package, for example, it's Roundup Ready, well, you can't just spray Roundup out there. That's not going to kill the ones that were out there from before. So people start talking about, well, what if I use something like Select Max to kill that corn?
Or Sure or Fusilade, but the problem is you've got roughly a 7-day plant back there. There's a tiny amount of residual in the soil, so you can't plant your seed right away. That's the problem. You can go out and wipe it out with tillage. That's usually our suggestion. Or you could use something like Liberty or Gramoxone, but a lot of times Liberty and Gramoxone only burn the plant to the ground. They may not kill the growing point. So going out and spraying to kill the corn, and you want to go in and plant the very next day, probably not going to be perfect.
All right, now when we look at something like soybeans, a lot of guys want to patch things in. They say, well, I've got 50,000 out there. I'm just going to throw another 75,000 plants out there. Now I've got plants of all varying sizes. And
you can get by with that in soybeans. You can't get by with that very well in corn, though.
Well, as you can see, replanting decisions and stand evaluations are not easy things.
Well, it's not, and like for Darren and me, we'll debate a little bit about this too. Again, for me, my threshold is a lot different than what Darren's is. Darren will say replant, and I'll say, nope, let's let it sit.
Well, this is why you need to talk with your neighbors, maybe even your brother occasionally, a crop insurance person. Get some good opinions about what to do, because chances are you're not the only one in your area facing these choices.
And you're probably not the only one in your area facing our Weed of the Week either. We'll tell you how to control it coming up next.